The penthouse office overlooked the harbor, sunlight bouncing off the glass like a million tiny diamonds. Anya, stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, the city stretching endlessly below me. Our startup had been my life for the past 5 years. Late nights, endless pitches, sleepless weekends. But I had loved every second of it. It wasn't just a company. It was a vision, a statement, a declaration that innovation and ethics could coexist. Julian stood behind me, casual as ever. A man whose charm had once made my heart race, whose intellect had drawn me to him, and whose cold ambition I had foolishly underestimated. He handed me a glass of iced tea, condensation dripping down the side. I took it, and the metallic tang on my tongue hit almost immediately. My fingers trembled. He sighed, as if explaining an unfortunate necessity. The board required a clean majority, Anya, he said softly, as if comforting a child rather than confessing murder. With you gone, the stock options revert entirely to me, and the acquisition closes flawlessly. Your desire to reinvest in R&D was not financially sound. My vision, years of sleepless nights, countless pitches, every idea poured onto whiteboards and into code, condensed into a single, chilling statement. My life, and my dream, was expendable. I fell into the leather chair behind the massive oak desk, the world tilting, my pulse weakening. Betrayal isn't loud. It's quiet and precise, like a scalpel across your chest. I tried to speak, but words lodged in my throat. I could feel the hum of the city below, hear the faint hiss of water against the harbor, and all of it felt like a cruel echo. Julian was already walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows, checking the skyline, checking his reflection in the glass, unaffected. You see, Anya, he continued, now almost whispering, we both wanted success, but I know the real game. Vision without control is irrelevant. Passion doesn't pay dividends. I closed my eyes, tasting the metallic bite of the iced tea, feeling my consciousness dissolve, and for a brief, unbearable moment, I thought this was the end. But I didn't allow despair to consume me. Not fully. My mind raced ahead, even as my body betrayed me. If Julian thought he could erase my vision, he was mistaken. I would find a way, somehow, someday, to expose the flimsy foundations of his empire. To watch him clutch at wealth built on greed and fraud, thinking it invincible, and then see it crumble. As darkness pooled at the edges of my vision, I made a vow, clear and resolute. I would return. I would protect what I had built. And I would never allow greed to eclipse integrity again. Somewhere in the murky future, I could already see it. Julian, alone in his glass castle, his carefully curated image cracking under the weight of the truth I would reveal. And standing beside me, helping me restore justice, not for vengeance alone, but for the ideals that had always driven me, would be someone I could trust completely. The iced tea slipped from my fingers, shattering against the marble floor. It didn't matter. The glass broke, but I would rise. My vision would endure. I woke up to the familiar scent of chalk dust, ink, and faintly stale coffee. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows of a university lecture hall, catching the dust motes in the air. I blinked rapidly, disoriented, as though emerging from a fog I didn't understand. 20 years old. Back before Julian, before the boardroom betrayal, before the iced tea and the cold realization of greed. Somehow, I had been given a second chance, a blank page on which to rewrite everything. I rubbed my eyes and glanced down at the notepad in front of me. Sketches of financial models and business projections spilled across the page, crude but alive with possibility. My pulse quickened. I had memories of the future, flashes of mistakes and manipulations I couldn't ignore, and a clarity I had never possessed at 20. Julian. My thoughts snapped to him immediately. I knew what he would do, and the harm he would cause if left unchecked. I couldn't face the office this time, without preparation. That's when I noticed him. Rowan. He stood across the seminar hall, quietly observing a small group of students debating an investment strategy. Even at a glance, I could tell he was different from the others. Attentive, meticulous, cautious in his words, yet his presence carried an undeniable authority. Julian's long-suffering financial advisor, often ignored, dismissed, and underutilized, but someone who understood the structures of power in ways Julian never could, not the moral structures, at least. Rowan's eyes flicked briefly to mine, curious but guarded. That was the opening I needed. I approached him cautiously, letting my instincts guide each step. "Rowan," I said softly, almost a whisper, "there's a flaw in one of Julian's early investments. A critical, hidden liability. If unaddressed, it will collapse and take his entire portfolio down with it." He studied me, his eyes sharp and calculating. How do you know this?" he asked, the words cautious but not accusatory. "I've seen it," I admitted, careful not to say too much. "It's precise, a predictable chain of failures. I can show you exactly when it will happen and how to prevent it, but only if you commit to acting ethically. Julian trusts you to safeguard his interests, but I need you to safeguard the truth." His gaze lingered on me, assessing, weighing. I could feel the skepticism, the ethical conflict twisting beneath his calm exterior. "And why should I trust you?" he asked finally. "Because I don't need your trust," I replied firmly. "I need your integrity. The numbers, the contracts, they don't lie, but the people in power often do. Julian would manipulate, cut corners, and take risks that would ruin both himself and the people around him. If you act with me, we can correct the early mistakes before they compound into disaster." Rowan leaned back slightly, arms crossed, evaluating me with the patience of someone used to handling delicate, high-stakes situations. I could feel the tension, a careful battle between caution and the knowledge that acting now would prevent future chaos. Finally, his shoulders relaxed, and he extended a hand. "All right," he said, voice steady. "Show me what you see. If this is as critical as you claim, we prevent the collapse. But everything must be precise, no guesses, no half measures." I nodded, a sense of relief washing over me, tempered by the gravity of what lay ahead. Rowan wasn't just an advisor. He was the shield I needed, the partner I could trust to navigate Julian's manipulations without letting the truth be corrupted. And for the first time since waking in this lecture hall, I felt a spark of hope. We spent the afternoon poring over contracts, projections, and investment structures. Every number I revealed, every predictive insight I offered, was met with meticulous verification. Rowan listened, questioned, and adjusted, his calm intellect amplifying the foresight I had brought. Together, we began constructing the first defensive line against Julian before he could even realize it was necessary. By the time the sun dipped low behind the campus buildings, casting long shadows across the lecture hall, I realized something profound. This wasn't just strategy. This was the beginning of an alliance grounded in respect, morality, and shared purpose. Rowan wasn't just a tool to protect against Julian's greed. He was someone who, in a world of compromise, could see the value of absolute integrity. And for the first time since my life had been stolen in that penthouse, I felt ready to fight and to win. The sun hadn't yet risen over the city skyline when I arrived at the small financial office where Rowan preferred to meet before the chaos of the day began. The hum of fluorescent lights, the faint scent of brewed coffee, and the organized chaos of papers and laptops set the stage for what felt like the calm before the storm. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the knowledge I carried. Julian's greed was precise, calculated, and relentless, but for the first time, I had an ally who shared both vision and ethics. Rowan was already there, methodically reviewing a set of spreadsheets. His presence was quiet but commanding, the kind of focused calm that could stop a storm from toppling a fragile tower. He looked up as I entered, eyebrows slightly raised. "You're early," he said, voice steady but tinged with curiosity. "I needed to see the latest projections before the board meeting," I said, sliding a stack of papers toward him. "Julian has planned a series of early investments. Some are structured to look profitable, but carry hidden liabilities that will cascade into disaster if left unchecked." Rowan's eyes narrowed as he skimmed the documents. "I've noticed anomalies," he admitted. "I assumed they were oversights. But your analysis, it's detailed, precise. Too precise to be coincidence." That's because it's not coincidence, I said, keeping my tone calm. I know what happens if these early moves proceed unchecked. Julian's drive for control and profit blinds him to the actual structural weaknesses of his ventures. We can correct them now, prevent disaster, and ensure he never exploits anyone again. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his dark hair. We'll need absolute discretion, he murmured. Even the slightest hint of our interference will raise questions, and Julian is suspicious by nature. One wrong move, and he'll cover his tracks faster than we can respond. I nodded. I know. We have to act quietly. Correct the missteps, prevent financial collapse, and stay invisible. That's why I came to you. You're precise, you're loyal to the principles of integrity, and you won't bend for personal gain. Rowan's gaze softened slightly. I don't usually work with clients who offer warnings about the future, he said, almost half smiling. But there's something about your conviction that I trust. Show me exactly what you foresee. Together, we pored over Julian's early investments, line by line, uncovering hidden risks, overstated valuations, mismanaged allocations, contracts loaded with clauses favoring short-term gain over sustainability. Rowan was meticulous in translating my insights into actionable strategies. For every flaw I identified, he drafted corrective maneuvers, adjusting cash flows, modifying contractual language, and redirecting assets to protect the company's integrity without alerting Julian. It wasn't easy. Julian was cunning, always one step ahead, or so he thought. But Rowan and I worked like clockwork, each of us filling gaps the other could not see. His steady hands executed precise interventions while I anticipated his moves before they could unfold. There was an unspoken rhythm between us, a synergy that made our alliance more powerful than I had imagined possible. Hours passed, punctuated only by the occasional clatter of a keyboard or the scratch of a pen. Rowan's calm, measured approach grounded me. I realized, in a way I hadn't before, how much I had craved someone who could match my intensity without fear or manipulation. Someone who understood that integrity could be as powerful a weapon as strategy. By mid-afternoon, the first corrections were in place. Julian's carefully crafted plans were subtly rerouted, the hidden liabilities neutralized without his awareness. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. I allowed myself a brief, private smile. For the first time, Julian's control had cracks, and Rowan and I were positioned to widen them. As we closed the files, Rowan glanced at me, his eyes lingering for a moment longer than necessary. There was no rush, no pressure, just a quiet acknowledgement of trust. I knew then that this partnership was no longer just about preventing Julian's greed from destroying everything. It was about building something stronger, a foundation of precision, loyalty, and shared conviction. And for the first time since that poison glass, I felt unstoppable. The city lights shimmered through the office windows like scattered constellations, but there was no beauty in their reflection tonight. I sat across from Rowan, the papers and spreadsheets between us glowing faintly under the desk lamp, evidence of the quiet battle we were about to wage. Julian's latest maneuver was a subtle one, invisible to anyone but someone with foresight and patience. And we had both in abundance. Rowan rubbed his temples, his usually composed demeanor flickering with the weight of our task. This is delicate, he said softly. One wrong disclosure, and Julian will suspect interference. He'll tighten his grip even further. I leaned forward, tapping the figures he had flagged. Exactly. That's why this first strike has to be invisible, yet effective. We're not confronting him directly. We're reshaping the foundation beneath his feet. If done correctly, he won't know what hit him until the collapse is unavoidable. Rowan's hands moved across the documents with precision, adjusting allocations, redirecting projections, and drafting subtle amendments to contracts that would later ensure accountability. It's satisfying, he murmured, almost to himself, to see this level of manipulation used for good. I allowed myself a quiet smile. There was a strange thrill in our quiet rebellion against Julian's greed. Each calculated step was a small victory, a demonstration that control could be wrested without a fight, without exposure. It was the kind of precision only Rowan could manage, and I had come to trust his judgment implicitly. The first strategic strike was simple in theory, but demanding in execution. Julian was set to approve a high-risk investment tied to a new tech acquisition. The projected profit was irresistible to him, a glittering carrot that masked the instability of the deal. I had identified the flaw weeks before it manifested, a miscalculation in projected growth tied to volatile market behavior. Rowan, we reroute the early funding into a secure subsidiary, I instructed. Mask it as standard operational expenditure. By the time Julian notices, the deal will be restructured, the hidden risk mitigated, and he'll believe it's his own initiative that succeeded. Rowan nodded, his jaw tight with concentration. He implemented the plan flawlessly, his fingers flying across the keyboard, his voice calm as he explained each subtle adjustment. We'll maintain full transparency with our legal obligations, but Julian won't be able to exploit the flaws. As the night deepened, I watched him work, marveling at the meticulous rhythm he maintained. There was something hypnotic about the precision, the quiet dedication. Rowan didn't just follow instructions. He anticipated the moves Julian would make next, embedding safeguards into every layer of the financial architecture. When the final adjustments were made, I leaned back in my chair, exhaustion settling into my shoulders. It's done, I said softly. The first strike is complete. Julian won't know until it's too late to reclaim control. Rowan met my gaze, his eyes dark and unreadable for a moment, then softened. And we're still invisible, he said, almost smiling. That's the best part. I felt a rush of gratitude, a rare warmth that had nothing to do with strategy or victory. Rowan's presence grounded me in a way no one else had. Quiet, deliberate, reliable. He was my anchor in this storm of betrayal. I realized, not for the first time, that our connection was becoming more than strategy. It was trust, respect, and something deeper, something that stirred in the quiet moments between calculations. We stayed in the office long after the strike was executed, reviewing and double-checking every detail. Occasionally, our hands brushed over a document, and the contact lingered just a second longer than necessary. It was a small, unspoken acknowledgement of our growing bond, a momentary intimacy hidden behind spreadsheets and financial models. By the time dawn began to creep across the skyline, the first strike had set in motion a chain reaction Julian could neither see nor control. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope, not just for our mission, but for the possibility of something real between Rowan and me. The war was just beginning, but with him by my side, I knew we had the precision, the patience, and the moral compass to see it through. The boardroom smelled of polished wood and stale coffee, a sharp contrast to the adrenaline racing through my veins. I sat quietly at the far end of the long table, my fingers tracing the edge of the portfolio I had brought, the one containing Rowan's meticulous revisions to Julian's investment plan. The tension was electric. Julian was present, all charm and arrogance, unaware that the very foundation of his plan had been subtly shifted right under his nose. Rowan was beside me, calm as ever, his posture precise, hands resting lightly on the table. The quiet confidence he exuded was contagious, grounding me when my pulse threatened to betray my composure. "Stay focused," he whispered, the words almost lost beneath the murmurs of the other board members. "Stick to the facts. Let them see the numbers, not us." Julian began his presentation, his voice smooth and commanding, projecting the image of control he so desperately clung to. I watched him closely, every word, every gesture, every confident smile. He had no idea that the investment he was about to champion had been quietly rerouted, secured against his reckless assumptions. I leaned slightly toward Rowan, careful to keep my voice low. He'll never see the discrepancy until the returns start to deviate. The seed of his frustration is already planted. Rowan's eyes flicked to mine, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at his lips. "Patience, Anya. Let him speak. Let the numbers tell the story." The first questions came, polite inquiries from board members masked as curiosity. Julian responded with practiced ease, explaining projections, timelines, and potential returns. But as the discussion progressed, I noticed subtle confusion creeping into his expression. The figures were correct, because Rowan had made sure of that, but the underlying structure no longer favored him. His projected windfall was quietly neutralized. A senior board member's voice cut through, sharp and analytical. "Julian, the projections here differ from what we reviewed last week. Can you clarify why the expected ROI has decreased despite the same investment?" Julian's smile faltered. Yes, well, there have been some minor adjustments." His eyes flicked toward me and Rowan, searching for an ally he could manipulate. But there was no weakness, no panic. Just quiet assurance. I saw Rowan's hand brush against mine under the table, subtle but grounding. He didn't need words. His presence reminded me that I was not alone. I drew a slow, steadying breath and allowed my gaze to meet Julian's. For the first time, the arrogance he wielded like armor faltered. He sensed something was amiss, but he had no proof, no way to trace the quiet intervention that had already shifted the balance. The meeting stretched on, the tension building as Julian fumbled for justifications while Rowan calmly clarified the risk mitigation strategies he had implemented. I felt a surge of satisfaction, a quiet triumph in the knowledge that Julian's greed and overconfidence were being countered without confrontation, without exposure. When the meeting concluded, Julian left with his forced composure intact, though the subtle cracks in his control were visible to those who knew where to look. Rowan exhaled quietly beside me, brushing a stray strand of hair from my face in a gesture that was both protective and intimate. "You handled yourself well," he murmured, his voice low and steady, the warmth behind it unmistakable. "You've learned patience and precision, better than anyone I've seen." I allowed a small smile, a brief moment of vulnerability. "I couldn't have done it without you," I admitted. His fingers lingered against mine, grounding me, tethering me to something more than strategy. As we walked out of the boardroom together, side by side, I felt it, the subtle shift from partnership to something more. Rowan's quiet strength, his unwavering moral compass, had become my anchor. And for the first time, I realized that the war against Julian wasn't just about reclaiming control. It was about building something honest, strong, and unbreakable with the man beside me. The office felt colder than usual that morning, though the autumn sun streamed through the tall windows. Julian's presence lingered like a storm cloud over the city's skyline visible from my corner office. He had discovered the first subtle shift Rowan and I had orchestrated during the board meeting, the small adjustments in the investment portfolio that had derailed his plans, but he had no proof of my involvement. Yet, the air hummed with tension, a prelude to the calculated retaliation I knew he was preparing. I sat at my desk, reviewing the next wave of potential moves Julian could make. Rowan's laptop was open beside mine, filled with projections, contingency plans, and meticulously documented adjustments to every early investment Julian had set his sights on. He worked in silence, his fingers moving quickly across the keys, creating an intricate network of financial safeguards that I could only marvel at. "You've done it again," I whispered, not looking up from the spreadsheets. "He won't know what hit him, but he'll feel the sting." Rowan's gaze lifted, calm but intense, his eyes meeting mine. "That's the plan," he said quietly. "The more he struggles to find a pattern, the more obvious it will become that his control was illusory from the start. And this time, he'll dig himself deeper." I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of the strategy settle around us. There was something about Rowan's quiet authority, his unwavering ethical standard, that made me trust him implicitly. Even now, as Julian schemed behind polished smiles and subtle manipulation, I felt a sense of security I hadn't known before. The first sign of Julian's counterstrike came via a terse phone call from a mutual investor. "Anya, I'm concerned," the voice said, clipped cautious. "Julian's putting pressure on our partnership. He's suggesting rapid liquidation of certain assets. He insists it's urgent." I shared a look with Rowan and he nodded. "He's testing the waters," he said. "Panic moves to see if you'll blink. But we've already prepared for this. I'll handle it." Rowan's intervention was quiet, almost imperceptible. He called the investor, walked them through the calculations, the potential risks, and the ethical obligations they held. By the time Julian realized the investor wasn't biting, his attempt to force compliance had already failed. It was subtle, surgical, and entirely effective. Later that evening, the office was quiet except for the soft hum of our computers. Rowan leaned back in his chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose, and I couldn't help but notice the faint crease of tension that hadn't been there in the morning. I reached out, placing my hand over his. "You should relax," I murmured. "You did everything perfectly." His eyes softened, and for a brief moment, the professional armor slipped. "It's not just about strategy," he admitted. "It's about trust. I need to know we're aligned, that we won't falter when he escalates further." I squeezed his hand, feeling the weight of our connection. "We won't falter. We're in this together." He exhaled, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. "Together," he echoed, and the word carried more weight than any spreadsheet or strategy document. As I left the office that evening, I walked beside Rowan, side by side through the streets bathed in amber streetlight. The city seemed quieter now, safer somehow, as if our silent counterstrike had reshaped the world around us. He didn't reach for my hand. Not yet, but his presence was enough, a protective shadow I could lean on, reassurance that the battle against Julian was no longer mine alone. For the first time, I realized that what Rowan and I were building, this unspoken alliance of ethics, strategy, and loyalty, was stronger than any contract Julian could manipulate. And perhaps, quietly, it was something more than professional. The morning air in the office was crisp, but the tension was thicker than any winter fog. Julian had realized that every one of his early schemes had been anticipated, rerouted, or entirely neutralized. Today, he was coming for the final audit, the last attempt to prove dominance over the very empire he had once co-built with me. And I was ready, with Rowan quietly stationed beside me, his presence steady, unyielding. I reviewed the documents for the third time, my pen tracing each line with deliberate precision. Every contract clause, every investment account, every subtle manipulation Julian had attempted was already mapped and countered. The audacity of his betrayal had cost him more than he realized. His name was already teetering on the edge of public scrutiny. Rowan leaned over my shoulder, pointing at a subtle error Julian had overlooked. "See here," he whispered. He assumed no one would verify the timestamp. "It's a minor detail, but it will unravel his final claim." I nodded, feeling a surge of satisfaction. "Perfect. Let's make it crumble without him knowing we pushed the first domino." When Julian entered the room, his polished smile did little to mask the tension behind his eyes. He greeted us with customary charm, though I could detect the undercurrent of desperation. He didn't notice the quiet exchange of glances between Rowan and me, the unspoken communication that ensured every step he took would be carefully anticipated. The audit began. Julian presented his documentation with the practiced confidence of someone who believed in control, but Rowan's meticulous preparation left him stumbling at every corner. Small inconsistencies, invisible to anyone untrained, emerged under Rowan's scrutiny. Every attempt to spin numbers or rationalize the risks collapsed under the weight of truth. I watched him falter, a mixture of satisfaction and disbelief stirring in me. It wasn't glee, it was the quiet triumph of justice, of ethics, of all the work Rowan and I had meticulously built over weeks of preparation. Julian's frustration was palpable, a storm contained behind a veneer of civility. As the audit drew to a close, Rowan finally leaned back, eyes softening, and offered me a small nod. I felt the tension break in that instant, a wave of relief washing over me. Julian's last desperate attempts had failed. He would walk away with nothing but the bitter taste of defeat. After the auditors left, the office was silent except for the quiet hum of computers. Rowan turned to me, and for the first time that day, he allowed a small, genuine smile to touch his face. "It's done," he said softly. I exhaled, leaning back in my chair. "Yes, it's finally done." My hand reached for his almost instinctively, finding his grip firm and grounding. He squeezed gently, eyes locking with mine. "You've carried so much," he murmured, voice low but unwavering. "Not just the company, Not just the fight, but everything that comes with trusting the wrong people. You shouldn't have had to face that alone. I didn't, I replied, a quiet smile breaking through. Not anymore. The office felt warmer now, the battle over, the weight lifted. Rowan's hand stayed in mine, a promise that this wasn't just professional solidarity, it was something deeper, something steady and true. The first small step of trust, unspoken but profoundly understood. He leaned closer, brushing a stray strand of hair from my face. The gesture was simple, intimate, and somehow tender in a way that made my chest tighten. "I've got you," he whispered. And then, a soft, deliberate kiss, just enough to convey loyalty, comfort, and a hint of the closeness I had been yearning for without even realizing it. For the first time in months, I felt truly safe, not just from Julian's schemes, but from the uncertainty of trusting another. Rowan was more than a partner in strategy, he was a partner in life. And as we sat there in the quiet aftermath, hands entwined, I realized that the foundation we had built was unshakable, and that perhaps, in time, it would be something even stronger than I had imagined. The sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the office, reflecting off polished desks and the glass walls of our new boardroom. It was a different world from the cold, calculating environment Julian had tried to dominate, a world that Rowan and I had built together, brick by brick, document by document, principle by principle. I stood at the head of the boardroom table, reviewing the final merger documents for our newly formed ethical investment firm. Every clause had been meticulously drafted, every potential loophole accounted for. My eyes scanned the numbers and projections one last time, but this time, the tension that had haunted me for so long, the fear of betrayal, the worry of hidden agendas was gone. Rowan stood beside me, his presence steady and grounding. I caught his eye, and he offered a quiet nod that said more than words ever could. He had been my anchor through months of relentless strategy, through Julian's desperate attempts to reclaim control, and through the quiet, tense hours we had spent ensuring every risk was mitigated. "I think we're ready," I murmured, my voice filled with both relief and a sense of triumph. Rowan's hand found mine, the connection firm, grounding, and filled with a shared understanding of everything we had endured. He smiled, and for the first time, there was a softness in his gaze that went beyond professional admiration.
"We've earned this," he said.
"And now it's ours." The moment felt suspended, as if the world had paused just for us. I let myself relax against him, leaning into the quiet strength he radiated. The months of scheming, planning, and cautious trust-building had culminated here, not just in the success of our firm, but in the profound closeness that had grown between us. "Anya," Rowan said softly, brushing a loose strand of hair from my face, "you've carried so much weight, but you don't have to anymore. I've got you." His words, gentle and deliberate, made my chest swell with a mixture of relief and something warmer, something I had been keeping at bay through every strategic calculation. I laughed softly, a sound of liberation, and shook my head. "I think I finally believe it," I whispered. Rowan stepped closer, his hands firm on my shoulders, and leaned down. His lips met mine in a kiss that was slow, confident, and entirely sure, an acknowledgement of every long night of trust, every victory over Julian's schemes, every shared secret and silent understanding. It wasn't just romantic. It was grounding, affirming, a promise that whatever challenges the world might throw at us, we would face them together. When we finally pulled back, our foreheads pressed together, Rowan's thumb traced the line of my jaw in a gesture so tender it made me ache with gratitude. "This is just the beginning," he murmured. I smiled, feeling the weight of past betrayals fall away completely. "Then let's make sure it's everything we've dreamed of," I replied, entwining my fingers with his. Outside, the city hummed with life, indifferent to our personal victories, yet the warmth of the sunlight and the quiet certainty of Rowan's presence made it feel as though the entire world had realigned to our favor. Julian's schemes were nothing but distant shadows, irrelevant and powerless. We spent the next moments in the boardroom, not as colleagues bound by contracts, but as partners, Two people who had weathered deceit, built something lasting, and discovered in each other not only trust, but the profound comfort of love. Rowan's hand never left mine, and every glance, every small gesture, spoke of a bond that was deeper than strategy, deeper than work. It was unshakable. Years later, the firm thrived, renowned not just for its financial success, but for its integrity. And through it all, Rowan and I remained the perfect merger, not just in business, but in life. The stability, the shared vision, the love we had nurtured through trials and triumphs, this was the ultimate acquisition, one that could never be taken away. And as I looked at Rowan, smiling softly, I realized that the greatest investment I had ever made wasn't in stocks or contracts. It was in him, and he had delivered returns beyond measure.